Welcome to Season 3 of Everything is Learning.
The podcast where we question, explore, and learn on purpose.
We're here to rethink and discover what's possible because learning never stops and neither do we.
Let's dive in.
Welcome back to Season 3 of Everything is Learning. We've been meeting new people along our own learning journey of creating this podcast, and we'd love to introduce you to someone new today. Today we have our new friend Susie to share her learning journey and impact with us. Susie's the Director of Operations for Venture Atlanta. She's infectiously passionate and devoted to learning. She's a self-identified STEM nerd and is in relentless pursuit of growth and improvement. With years of experience educating learners and helping them unlock their potential, she believes education isn't just about grades. It's about growth, confidence, and curiosity. Whether she's breaking down tough concepts or cheering on small wins, Susie is all about empowering learners to think big and love the process. Susie, welcome to Everything is Learning. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
We're so excited to learn about your learning journey and different purposes and how you impact learners and how you are a learning mentor for people. But to kick off our conversation, I'd like to start with this icebreaker question. Can you tell us about a concept or subject that you've always wanted to teach someone?
The ability to ask for help. And it's
That's a good one.
so difficult. And I know that my people pleasers out there and the ones that just don't want to, it's so difficult when I'm trying to convince students the importance of regularly going to office hours and just kind of getting to know your teachers or professors and practicing that. And it's like riding a bike, right? Like once you do it the first time and you break that barrier, it gets a little bit easier and easier to do it when you realize that you're in trouble. But what I've found is that especially the ones who are used to getting good grades at a certain point, but then aren't maybe excelling in certain areas later on, have a really, really difficult time asking for help when things start to slip. And that self-advocacy is just something so important, but I mean, you can go well into your adulthood before you learn how to do it. And in fact, there's still plenty of adults who still don't know how to do that and still try to save the world and take on the world themselves, as opposed to understanding and recognizing and being able to apply that in a way that's going to set themselves up for success in other areas. So yeah, man, if I could have every single student that I've ever worked with just work on that and get that as their takeaway, that would be amazing.
It sounds like a core value for you, self-advocacy and being able to do that and ask for help. So tell us about that with you. Like, where did you first learn? How old were you? Do you have a memory on when you realized that asking for help is actually a superpower as opposed to being a deficit?
Oh my goodness. This goes back all the way back to the beginning. So yes, there was this particularly resonates true with me because that was a big part of my story. So I actually grew up in New Orleans, and I did okay in school, and I can go a little bit more in detail later, but I feel like I was able to excel in elementary school and middle school because of specific key educators along the way who spent extra time trying to help me and get me to where I needed to be. But then Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, and I was displaced and homeless for a while. And while we were jumping around from shelter to shelter, I ended up in Georgia in Marietta, and I ended up finishing out high school there, and then ended up going to Georgia Tech, which Georgia Tech in itself is an extremely challenging, academically challenging environment. And I think it's when I went, I was surrounded by a lot of peers who were really great at sort of, they were great self-learners. So they were great at taking concepts from textbooks and sort of teaching themselves. And that was never a skill that I had. And because I had to be that student, my entire life and my identity was based around excelling in school. And because school had always been a safe place for me, especially during times of instability or just uncertainty throughout my childhood, it was really my safe place and the place that I felt happiest and safest. Um, so that having been such a core part of my identity, that's why I had such a hard time when I started struggling in my new high school in Marietta and at Georgia Tech. And things just kept piling and piling and piling. And there were certain key moments when I had professors and teachers take me aside and sort of point out certain things that I learned along the way that about myself and about my learning that sort of inspired me to get tested after I graduated. And I learned a lot about myself, and I set on a path to try to work on those things over time. And then I ended up going back to school for a while, and found that I had grown significantly in those years, and it was all thanks to those key individuals, those educators who were so passionate enough to recognize that in me and motivate me. And now, when I went into tutoring right after college, I was able to really, really connect well with particularly students with LDs. And so learning differences. And so I think that my experiences helped me connect with them on a level that I think maybe they didn't necessarily have before. It's great to have someone go and advocate for you, but it's more important for me to show them how to advocate for themselves. Because if I had someone to teach me how to advocate for myself all those years ago, my high school and college experience would have been so different. And I wish more than anything that I had that kind of mentor during some of those darkest years. So it's, yeah, that's why it's just so important to me.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. And awesome that you're paying it forward in that way. Like how amazing it must feel when it comes full circle, because a lot of what you're doing has delayed gratification. So the fact that you're seeing some of those pay off, it's amazing. And that you took what these amazing educators did for you and you're instilling that in others. So they impacted potentially just one person who's impacting dozens, hundreds potentially even of others. And that's amazing. And so I have a son who is diagnosed with an LD. He's on the ASD spectrum. And for our audience, is the autism spectrum. And self-advocacy isn't immediately what I'm teaching him, given what you just said about help. And learning to do things now, help is a sign that we are currently teaching. And he's doing pretty well with that. He does need some physical help, but the reality is knowing what you talked about and how impactful that was for you, and that is such an incredible lesson. So that, because self-advocacy is asking for help when you need it, I need to role model that. So thank you. You're becoming a learning mentor for me.
Yes, and one of the things about ASD and really any sort of trauma survivor or any really any children who have any kind of background in adversity, it's they have a difficult time verbalizing when they're in distress and so even recognizing that and then verbalizing that and then knowing which resources to reach out to ask for help, all of those are such key but difficult skills to learn and practice. And it's so great that you're getting started early and recognizing that and wanting to help them with that. Because I do think that it's something that you can work on little by little, but it does take time. And every time I see one of my students, get a little vulnerable with me, or have a breakdown before a session and just express how overwhelmed they feel or how stuck they feel or just how hopeless they feel, I have to tell them, okay, but the important thing is you're here and you showed up. And I want you to associate this asking for help thing with being courageous, because it does require bravery for you to admit that you're wrong. Do you know how many adults can't even admit being wrong, or they can't even admit when they don't know something?
Right.
You know how many college professors have trouble admitting when they don't know something? My favorite professors when I went back to school were the ones who could actually admit when they're asked a question that they didn't know the answer. They were my favorite, but they were few. So I want them to understand that it's important and it's courageous, and to associate it with a positive thing.
I love that you're talking about that in particular, because you're almost encouraging a sense of vulnerability, which I think is also something that it's a skill. It is a learning skill, whether people want to admit it or not. You cannot learn without being vulnerable. I truly, truly believe that. And I feel like I often wonder where vulnerability takes place in learning, where people are teaching it throughout a learner's journey, right? So what role does vulnerability play in the way that you're teaching others? Like, how do you model that for your students? Because you seem like you're very open, you seem very passionate, and you are obviously charged by helping others, which I love. But I think that you can also help others without being vulnerable. And I think that it's not as authentic. So I'm just wondering, like, where does vulnerability play in how you help learners?
Yeah, so I think, and this comes back to how the dynamic between an educator and a student is, it's a long-term relationship, and it truly is a give and take. And just as much as the student will get as much out of something, an experience that they put into it, I think the same goes for educators. And not just in a way that they're investing time and commitment into coming up with lesson plans or some of those more physical aspects, but also the underlying emotional aspects. So I think one of the things that really enabled me to connect to my students on a deeper level was my ability to empathize with them. And I noticed that they were far more open to the learning experience and to trusting me when I made myself vulnerable to them and I shared a little of my story or some of my struggles, or I showed them how human I am too. Because I think when you're growing up and you're especially in high school or some of those impressionable years, it's so easy to see your teachers and professors as something larger than life, something
infallible,
like just right, infallible. And you almost see them as like like Greek gods or goddesses, or just or just immortal beings, um and I hear students say things all the time like, oh, they'll assume things like, oh, they're gonna think I'm stupid, or oh, I can't ask that question because he'll just roll his eyes. Or now some of these students might be saying that because of prior experiences or prior negative experiences that they've had with interactions with educators, but a lot of times they say those things to me before they've actually gone to talk to their teacher or professor. And so it's a lot of times it's kind of a fear that they've built up in their heads. And it takes a couple of experiences of positive exchanges before the students can feel more comfortable with doing that. Um, but it's when you can kind of dispel that that myth that you're this all-knowing expert, and you can kind of put yourself on the same level as the student and say, look, I'm human just like you, and actually this is something that I still struggle with, and that's okay. It's okay for you not to know this, and it's okay for you to fail at things that you try. And shameless plug into science and STEM, that's such a key important part of STEM. It's I
Yeah.
can't call myself a true scientist if I don't value and appreciate and love failure, because failure is learning. Failure is more information. I now know something I didn't know before. That was one of the first things they ever taught us in my biology program at Georgia Tech, and just hammered into us. Failure is important, and that doesn't reflect anything about you as a student. Even negative experience that you have from going to ask for help from specific teachers, like maybe someone scoffed at you, maybe you had a negative experience one time. That's not reflective of all the teachers, and especially not reflective of you as a student and as a person. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean you're any less capable of getting to where I am, or where Mr. So-and-so is, or where Dr. So-and-so is. They started out as humans too, and they have different superpowers. It's just, you have to learn your own, but you also have to be able to accept the times that you do need help and you need to go ask for it.
So we, on our podcast, we talk a lot about reframing things, right? And one of the ones that we talked about in season 1, and kind of all throughout season 2 too, is reframing failure, because society tells us that failure is bad. But you're talking about science in particular, and I think that can be so easily applied to life. Like, failure gives us data, failure gives us opportunity, failure gives us something. And I think a lot of the times people think that failure is a shut door. And I think it taps into people's fear of judgment, which you also talked about. So there's this fear of being judged. There's this fear of whatever negative experience happened to somebody, will happen to them again. And there's that push and pull of a learner where they're like, well, this one thing happened. I'm not necessarily sharing it with everyone, but it's something that I have now internalized. How do you work with students and learners and even educators or learning mentors to become resilient or accept failure and kind of change that mindset?
Oh, this I actually think I learned. I kind of already implemented this a little bit in tutoring, but then I kind of learned a more procedural method for this when I was a supplemental instructor when I went back to school as an adult at GSU. So one of the things that they taught SI leaders to do was um, the practice of waiting. And
Oh my goodness.
they
Critical
actually
skill.
made us take like a timer after we posed a question and a student was struggling, and we had to wait like a specified amount of time. And it's when you first start out, it's so awkward. It's so
Painful.
awkward. And you have to watch them sweat and struggle. And I'm telling you, for some of the more sensitive students, sometimes you'll see them start to tear up
It's heartbreaking.
because it really is. And you see them break down. And that's when you finally get to see, oh, that's what being wrong or not knowing, that's the significance of what that means to that student.
It tells you
That's
so
how
much.
important it is to them. And that it tells you so much about their personalities, their values, their just everything.
I love
Oh, it
that
just
you've tacked on like the emotional piece to that too, because as awkward as it is, as funny as it can look at times, how someone is on the outside, it's so valuable, I think, in the day to day to give wait time and to teach
yes.
people, especially in a society of where we expect everything to happen automatically and right away, and learning to wait even as an adult is hard. Like, I see adults in a Starbucks line and they cannot wait. They like,
Yes.
or in a drive-through and people are beeping, or at a stoplight and it's like, it's red. Why are you beeping? You know what I mean? Like, it's
Yes.
not just children. It's in that imagery that you gave of people crying when they don't have the answer right away. The value of teaching a child at a young age to wait and seeing their response is so impactful. And I know for me, the first time that I was told, and Marissa, maybe you have a memory of this too, but when I was told to wait for something and I didn't have the answer right away and I was supposed to let it come to me, I remember it. It was Miss Genthner in 5th grade. She was teaching me math, and I stayed after school, and she was like, Elena, just let it come to you. And I remember crying. And I remember feeling like if I didn't have the answer right away, it meant I was dumb. And
Yeah,
the
there's
impact,
helplessness.
it is. It's helplessness, but it's also because our parents valued intelligence. And so for me, I felt that if I didn't have the automatic answer, I wasn't intelligent. And then as an adult, it meant that if I'm in a meeting with somebody, I have to give a really good answer right off the cuff. And I'm only unlearning that like in the last 5 to 6 years because of a learning mentor that I had who said, wait. Like, what a powerful thing that somebody has taught you in how to be a better learning mentor. But Marissa, like, do you ever remember a moment where you were told to wait and to, because you're a curious person and you ask questions all the time.
Yeah,
So I'm just
I
wondering if
feel
you
bad.
remember something.
Not specifically, but I'm sure something will come to me. I will say this though, as you were talking about failure and how it's courageous, and as you were talking about waiting and not knowing the answer is acceptable, some things came to mind for me. One of which was, a lot of times, at least for me, the reason that people struggle to overcome failure, or the amount of times that people encounter failure and feeling run down and burnt out, is because of the level of effort, so that there's like this cycle of grief. And I really appreciated your vulnerability in sharing all of that, because for me, it's not even just that people fear failure from the lens of like, oh, what does this mean or say about me, but also like, I put all of this energy and time and resource, and this is what I got, And that can feel like a different obstacle to overcome. But the other thing I'll say about that is in the waiting period, it's like a lot of great thoughts that you didn't have the first time around come to you in that waiting period. But I will totally own I am an impatient person. And yes, curiosity really gets the better of me. I even find that with my own children, I sometimes find myself repeating the same thing because I'm not quite clear if they got it the first time, where if I just said it once and waited, it would probably have a very different impact. So I'm really glad we're talking about this because, like I said earlier, there are immediate impacts to this conversation that I'm going to apply to my own life. And I hope that's true for other listeners too.
I think you're getting into like critical thinking, right? And I think a lot of people talk about how that's a skill that people don't teach anymore is critical thinking skills. The youngest student that I work with for my executive functioning coaching is 10. And then the oldest one is actually I'm currently working with a 56-year-old mother of 11 who just had their baby leave the nest. And working with learners of all of these different ages, I find that critical thinking looks so different across different ages. And you were just talking about high schoolers, right? But when it comes down to it, what do you think is the perfect age to start critical thinking?
I want to say as early as they're able to talk, really. I mean, I think that, and I think that I also want to add that there is not an age that's too late. I mean, will they be more
Beautiful.
stubborn?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Will they give you more attitude? Absolutely. But is it too late? Never. Because everyone, especially if they don't possess those critical skills, will ultimately get to a moment where they're going to hit rock bottom and be stuck. And life has a way of forcing you into those situations where you have to apply it some way or somehow. Um and so it's never too late. Um but I do think that it gets easier to do that, particularly in the middle school years. And I see that particularly with math and science. Um, though those are the years that uh, I see students develop their academic identities, for one, like how they view themselves, like, oh, I'm good at math, or oh, I've always been bad at math. It usually stems back to those years and their experiences with the fundamental pre-algebra, algebra, geometry concepts. They're also the years that they develop the foundational skills that are going to carry forward all through high school and even well into college. So if they don't get those down well, especially my students who went through all of middle school during the pandemic, oh, they had such a hard time by the time they got to high school.
Yeah.
And they would come to me and say things like, oh, I've never been good at math. And then when I dive in deeper and try to diagnose, okay, like where are our biggest areas of weakness, come to find out it might be like just in specific modules of algebra. And then when I talk to the parents will tell me, oh, yeah, that was the semester, or those were the semesters that they had to go all virtual and they were asynchronous. And then the teacher was pregnant and they had a sub for a year. And there's always something else to corroborate why there's a gap in their fundamentals. But it then cascades into how the rest of that building happens. And it can be such a stunting force for their development of critical thinking. But even at an extremely young age, that's why I think it's so important to foster and get them to associate asking questions and staying curious, because I think that's really the first step is is I've always wondered and wished that I could teach a love of learning to my students. Like, how do you do that? How do you instill that? Because how do you get them to love something? Because by the time they're in high school, it's like you try to tell a high schooler to suddenly love learning, they'll just roll their eyes at you and scoff
Yeah.
and say, "What? What a nerd." They won't they by that point they have their own interests and likes and dislikes and have their own personalities, but from a very, very young age, getting them to understand and love, really be excited about learning and really stay curious and really encouraging that is, I think, so crucial to then laying the foundations down for helping them into critical thinking um, and whatnot. And I always encourage people, if, especially at private schools and middle schools, if you have an elective somewhere where you can take some kind of logic or philosophy type course, do it. Because I think that the logical reasoning portion of some of those courses is so applicable in critical thinking in so many other subject areas that I almost wish it was a required course across the board. Just the ability to reason through, um, okay, if I know this to be true and I know this to be true, then I can deduct that blank. Or um, I know that this line of reasoning is a fallacy and this has a um, this could potentially be a logical distortion, and so I need to consider this. And that's why students struggle so much with those always, sometimes never type questions on quizzes and tests, because it does force them to apply that kind of reasoning to those questions. And so, and think about the exceptions.
But I am really interested in knowing, as far as all of the different opportunities and students you've worked with, do you have a favorite success story of someone whose learning journey transformed with your help? It's probably hard to pick one. I
Ooh, it
understand.
really is. I mean, I've just been, I don't know what it is, but I've just been so lucky with coming across students who are just so sweet and so loving and so hardworking, um, and have just taught me so much. Um,
That's actually a true testament of a learning mentor, is learning from the people that you are also imparting knowledge or skills to. That's such a beautiful cycle. Thank you for talking to that.
More than success stories, I think that it's easier for me to pinpoint the teachers and professors who have had
Oh,
an
sure.
impact on me and have changed my life,
Okay.
because there's specific people that come to mind that I it, I just I I've been better about this recently. Since the pandemic, I've gone back and started contacting them and reaching out and letting them know. But I think more students should totally let their educators know
Good call out.
what you mean to them, because a lot of times I'll hear from the parents years later and they'll say, so and so, you've had such a big impact on them, and I'm like, I didn't even know they liked me. They were just, I didn't hear from them for what? They won't. So tell your teachers, tell your professors. Um, but I need to be better about this. I need to go back and actually tell them what kind of impact they've had on me, because they really have changed my life forever. Like, um, I I had such self-confidence issues in my academic career, I always thought that there was something wrong with me, and I thought it was my fault. So it was the fact that I couldn't focus, the fact that I wasn't smart enough, the fact that I couldn't read quickly enough or whatnot. I saw that as a reflection of my intellectual ability and my lack of focus as a lack of discipline, and um, my struggles with that as laziness. So um, I can remember distinctly key members in high school, especially Mrs. Dutter, my AP Physics teacher. I remember one day um, she took me aside after school and looked through a test with me and asked me questions about the test. And what she noticed was that I missed all the multiple choice, but I got all the free response.
Hmm.
And
Well, it's not the opposite.
she talked me through and she said, "Wait, so you know this. I wonder, but I still failed because I missed all the multiple choice and that was half the test." And she said, "I wonder if why don't you come back next whenever and come sit in this class with me and just finish, don't worry about time, just finish the rest of your test, show me what you know, and that's it. Just do the best you can, show me what you know." And I went from failing to A's on tests. And the same thing happened to me in college. And both of those were in high school. It happened in my senior year. In college, it happened in my senior year. I had an incredible professor, my biochemistry professor, Dr. Schmidt-Cray. She, oh my gosh, she was the kindest, most empathetic, most caring professor. She was another one who I was in multiple courses with her. I was in her senior seminar and biochemistry course. I went to every single help session, every single optional thing that she put up online, I would do. And all my homeworks were A's. Same thing. I made a D on the first test. I went to go talk to her. She thought that I had a good handle on things, and she allowed me to take the test with her. And I went to A's.
Wow.
And that's when I learned that not everyone is a natural test taker. Test taking is a skill that you can learn. Some people are naturally gifted with it, but you can also learn it and develop it over time. But it's not something that just naturally occurs to everybody. And also that sometimes you can do your best and it might not be an indication of the type of student you are or have any reflection on your level of intelligence. Because I worked harder than so many of my peers, and those key people were able to see how hard I worked and saw the huge discrepancy in my level of effort and the different modes and all the different things that I tried versus the scores that came out from that Scantron machine, and took the time and care to notice and help find a way for me to show what I know. And that really, it forever changed my life, because then I went and got tested after I graduated, and that's when I found all those learning differences. And that's also, I'm so passionate about how learning differences get handled in public school systems. Because one of the great injustices I feel is that I was just so angry. I was like, well, how could this happen? How could I go through my entire academic career and no one said anything to anyone about all of these learning differences that I had? Why didn't anyone stand up for me? Why didn't anyone say anything? And that's when I started to do research about dyslexia and how dyslexia gets handled in schools and the testing process, the screening process, and even down to the diagnostics behind it. I mean, most people don't know that a lot of the testing that we do around dyslexia, the scales and the tests that those things are built on were built from data gathered on tests that they did with boys.
Yeah. It's the same thing for autism too, for the
Exactly.
ASD. It's mostly, I'm sure you know about this too, having a background in microbiology. A lot of just health in general is the testing and the data was done on men. It was not with females in mind at all. And that's why a majority of females in education, even starting at a very young age, are not diagnosed as quickly as boys. So people think that autism is, and it generally is, more diagnosable in boys because of the way it is tested than it is in girls. And it is a great, great tragedy. Because the other thing that you talked about, I started getting emotional. We were talking about learning mentors, but what you talked about and what you described is that learning mentors in your life, educators in your life, said this person is trying so hard. Their brain just works differently. I am not. They put it on themselves. I am not assessing her knowledge in a way where she can show what she knows. And that is the single greatest thing about outstanding learning mentors, is they recognize that every single human being has a different way of learning. And honestly, I got emotional partially because I identify with you in terms of learning journey and how you questioned yourself. But also, I just lost my greatest learning mentor recently. Sorry. He just passed away very suddenly a few days ago. And it is truly so important to tell people the profound impact that they have on you when they do change your life. And Corel Blakely changed mine. And I think it's so amazing. And I know from offline conversations with you that part of the reason you do what you do is because you want to give back and you don't want people to experience what you did. And I think that's a lot of the reason why Marissa and I do this podcast, because we want people to know they're not alone. We want people to know that their brain is beautiful and it tells them everything about who they are. And to be given that opportunity to sit down and say, this is who I am. This is how my brain works. This is so cool. Like, I get to learn more about myself and how I work every single day. Like, the profound impact that people had on you, Susie, and that you're having on other people, even in this conversation, is such a gift. Like, if nothing else, I hope that you are taking from this conversation what a success you have been and the profound impact that you have had. And, like, seriously, like, kudos to you.
If I could shout it from the rooftops, there's nothing standard about learning. Yes. Standardized testing and standardized learning is an injustice. And I love that you are empowering students to do what they can do successfully in their own unique way. Their approach, if it works for them, is what should continue to work for them. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that it's different from their peers. And thank you. Please keep doing what you're doing. Fight that good fight. That's how you're going to get people to love learning. That seriously is.
And I was going to say one other thing. So, Susie, the whole premise of our podcast is that learning and education are not synonyms.
Yes.
Learning can happen in educational settings, but learning and education are synonyms, and learning mentors and educators are also not synonyms. So I think that you've hinted to that along the way in this conversation, but I think the true impact that you are having, if someone ever asks you again, or if you ever are wondering on a day-to-day, is you are not only an educator who is educating students, you are a learning mentor who is forever having an impact on learners. You talked about how do you get somebody to be a lifelong learner. You do it by telling them that learning is fun, that they can be curious, that it is exciting, and you're doing all of those things. So I hope when you go through a list, when you sit down at some point in your very busy schedule, to say, these are all the wonderful things I am, but if nothing else, I am above all a learner and a learning mentor to people so that they can love learning as well.
Yes, and you actually hit right on something that I had a lot of mixed feelings about in my first undergraduate experience at Georgia Tech. In some of the first and second year courses, there's a lot of PhD researchers and grad students and whatnot, brilliant people, but unfortunately, these bright minds, what you were saying about there's a difference between learning and educators. I mean, it's they might be very, very smart, but that intelligence doesn't necessarily always translate to being a good a good teacher. It doesn't mean that you're good at teaching. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily good at communicating these complex topics in a way and laying it out in a logical, strategic way, in a way that really builds on each other. It really is so strategic when you build your curriculum and think about how to best frame everything and build skills on top of skills. And I really, really struggled with that. And I think a lot of my peers did too at Tech, when some of these intelligent, hyper intelligent PhD researchers would come and lecture about these incredibly advanced topics, but launch into it at a speed and an assumption of thinking that we already knew what he was talking about at a base level. And meanwhile, we're all like down here and we don't even know 3 of the words that he said in that sentence. So great teachers and great professors I've had have been really able to say, okay, it's not about me. It's not about me like showing off my PhD and my 15 years of whatever. It's about them. Let me first figure out how to gauge maybe where they are and then how to make this information, build it in a way that's not overwhelming, that makes sense, and help them through this journey. And it's really, really difficult for some individuals to understand the importance of starting at base level, covering the fundamentals and breaking it down into easily digestible concepts and building on that. Because PhDs are not always the best at that.
Hard to remember where they started because they've spent so much of their time invested in it. But yes, that's a really great point. And Elena, I appreciate that you brought it into this conversation, because I think why your students are so successful is you're able to break it down into digestible pieces for them to grow.
Absolutely.
I just think any experience where someone is learning, I mean, we believe that everything is learning. We're learning all the time, in every moment. And I think the one piece for me, I had started a PhD. I had been accepted into the program. I already had proposed my dissertation topic, and I had had several miscarriages and then was pregnant with twins and was very, very ill. So I stopped. But my proposal was based on how every educational and learning experience should be personalized. And I think what you're getting to, and I think the hard part of higher education, Marissa and I both went for our master's in service leadership and innovation with a higher education administration concentration. So
What a mouthful.
yeah, total mouthful. But we kind of talked while we were getting our master's about how even at that level, learning should be personalized. And that it's a little bit harder, but if you're doing that and people are going in, the learning mentors, the educators are going in, and they have that in the back pocket, whether they've been trained or not to be educators, they are still responsible as learning mentors to go in and personalize the learning, not just go in as a presenter to give information. That's not what educators are supposed to be doing, right? And I think that a lot of what happens in a one-on-one setting, like tutoring, is that you're able to personalize learning, and that is what is transformational for people. That goes back to your brain is beautiful, every brain is different. And I think that that's really the key to learning in general, is even at a small child, even at, virtually birth, a human being is taking in information. And we find this a lot when kids are very young. Like all of a sudden, for instance, my 3-year-old loves dinosaurs, right? And loves cars. So right now, my mother keeps being a grandmother and giving him cars, everything, and dinosaurs, everything, and all the time, right? So she's personalizing his learning and his passion at 3 years old. But all of a sudden, kids get to middle school or high school and nothing is personalized. And I think going back to what you said very early on, like there are criminal parts of learning and education where all of a sudden learning is no longer fun because you're told that you have to learn this particular topic in this particular way, or read this particular piece of literature in this particular way and answer only these questions. There's no open-endedness about this content that is being put down people's throats. And they're also not getting the information when they're told to do that and told to learn that your brain is different. So tell me how I should be teaching this to you. Tell me how you would like to learn this best. Tell me how you would like to be assessed most. And it sounds like a pipe dream, but I'm sure, Susie, you can talk to the fact that when you're in a tutoring session, you can do that for someone. So how are you personalizing learning in those sessions?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think that for the first couple of sessions before we deep dive into anything substantial, a lot of it is listening and observing. Because like you said, a lot of the students do sort of lead you to the way that they want to be taught, but also sometimes they might just be able to verbalize that to you and let you know what's worked in the past for them or what hasn't. And I always ask them, like, have you had tutors before? What did you like? What did you not like? What kinds of teachers at school, like, tell me about your experiences with them, like what worked for you, what didn't. And a lot of times they'll tell me things like, oh, well, this person only wrote out problems on the board and I just don't work like that. Or I need more structure, or I need more practice at home, or I need more visual input, or I need to visualize it, or I need to hear it. And everyone has, sometimes they'll tell me what has worked for them, but for the ones that haven't, a lot of it is observing and listening to what they say about their experience through problem solving. Sometimes I'll sort of like try to test the waters by taking samples of certain problem types and have them work it out in front of me and just talk me through it instead of just solving it. Like, talk me through what goes through their minds.
Right.
Like, how does your reasoning work? And talk it out loud. And understanding that can help me see, okay, if this is how this person thinks, then maybe they feel more comfortable with a more straightforward approach, or maybe this person needs more of a template, like a procedural approach of step 1, step 2, step 3. But not everyone is like that. So, yeah, it's just not one size fits all at all. And then being flexible enough to adapt to the feedback that the student gives, and not take it personally. And if they are telling you, this isn't working for me, then it's really up to the educator to try to present it in a different way or lead them to asking questions to explore that concept in a way that works for them.
If you could give one piece of advice to learners, so I mean learners of any age, if you could give one piece of advice to them to help them continue to love learning, what would it be?
Start with something you love. Start with something you're curious about. But it brings you, when people say, oh yeah, I went down a rabbit hole, start with one of those rabbit holes. Structure it and make some goals about what you want to learn about that area or that topic or that problem. I had a great one person in the VC world told me, start with a problem that you want to solve and think about what you'd like to do to try to solve it. And just practicing even that process of getting your body to associate that process of asking questions, of doing the research, of testing yourself and building hypotheses and checking them and learning to love that is, and associating that with being something amazing is a win right there. And if you can develop that and apply that to other areas of your life, even better. And I mean, that can be something as simple as arts and crafts or DIY or whatever your hobbies are. But you can then do it in a way that will allow you to apply that to other areas of your life too, and take that approach. And then reflect on that too. Like, after that experience, sit down, try to come up with a couple of bullet points on, okay, now how can I apply what I just did here to learn this thing to something else that I want to learn that maybe I'm not as passionate about or I don't love as much. Yeah, because I have to do that all the time.
Actually, I'm glad that you talked about, I'm glad you talked about the thing, like applying skills that you learned about things that you love. I also want to play devil's advocate a little bit to what you were saying earlier about how in middle school you're forced to learn things that you didn't want to. I started in physics, I wound up teaching Spanish, and now I'm in project and program management. Like, it was good that I was forced to learn things that I didn't think I was going to want to, because if I
Sure.
didn't do those things, then I probably wouldn't found the nuances. That said, it should not be straightforward. You have to do this. There should be, like, I operate from a place of why. Why do I want to? Do I need to know this? And it is not to question or be accusatory. It's like the curiosity part in me. But in some ways, I'm sort of glad, because when I met that challenge of something I really didn't like, that's where growth happens. So,
Oh yeah,
but
absolutely.
I have been fascinated by this conversation. I'm curious to know, and we ask this of our guests, what is a question you wish more people would ask you?
Can I make that a question I like to ask other people?
Yeah. Because if you ask other people, wouldn't it be nice if someone asked it to you, right?
Yeah.
What is that question?
Well, because when you were talking about how like you went from subject to subject, I mean, like I used to say for the longest time, like, oh yeah, I don't go anywhere near chemistry or physics. I don't go anywhere near any history, anything that involves reading. I don't touch anything like that. But of course, then you meet that one student that you just fall in love with and just you would do anything for and just melts your heart with those adorable little doe eyes, and you're like, fine, I'll do it. And you get sucked into I've gotten sucked into helping people with all kinds of subject I probably had no business and I always tell parents, like, just so you know, this is not something I know. I'm learning along the way too. But I get sucked into that because I have found that one of the things that is sort of my fuel, my ultimate motivation for learning, is the human connection.
Oh,
So
that's lovely.
sometimes I'm able to leverage that into learning something that I'm not as excited about learning about. So, for example, I used to do this when I went back to school and we were working on a particularly difficult unit. I used to create study groups of like my closest peers who were very serious about learning. And then I would plan a study session or like a tutoring session or something like that, that one of us was going to teach the group. And I would always try to pick whatever part of that unit that I felt the least comfortable about. Because when you have that pressure of worrying about looking stupid in front of your peers or your friends, you will make that study guide and you will read up on it. You will make sure you know it. And the
Accountability partners.
Yes, exactly. There's so many ways to leverage that human connection if you know that that's an important value for you. When it comes to when you were talking about executive functioning, like one of the things that I always tell students when they're going to meet with their executive functioning coaches, I say, look, ask your executive function coach, like, how you can build certain key things into your schedule. So going to all the recitations, going to all the office hours, don't make it optional. It doesn't matter if it says optional, it's mandatory for you. You have to go, because not only, like, learning is such an emotional and almost spiritual experience in a way. It's not just knowledge gaining. There's so many elements to that, and there's so many different motivations as humans that we have for how we get to learning, that if you can leverage any of those pieces to get there, no matter how you get there, you're going to get there. So if that means that you have a routine built into your schedule now, and you have a rapport with your professor because you go to office hours at the same time, same day every week, and even though that one concept is really difficult, that just adds just enough pressure that you want to go and make sure you read that part of the textbook. Go do that. If you develop friends in SI because you're going every week and you want to make sure that you're able to explain that one concept to your friends when they have trouble with it, use that to motivate you. I mean, whatever piece of it is, build that into your schedule, into your routine, and leverage it to help you learn when you don't want to.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that you said that learning is emotional, because we talk about how, like even with my own son, there's got to be confidence building. There's just a struggle with pretend play with him, and it's because there's not a lot of confidence around that. But when you learn something and you learn how to do it right, and then people celebrate, that feels good, and you want to keep doing it more. And so I love that you said that, because I think people think of learning as an exchange, almost transactional, which is something we've talked about before, and it's not, and it shouldn't be, and that's why it's so important to personalize. So thank you for that.
It should be emotional for everybody involved, right? Like, you're talking from a parent perspective, and Marissa, there's nothing more emotional, and we are new parents, Susie, like our kids are 4 and under, and it is emotional, like I'm not there every day with your son, but I love my nephew, and every time I see something different when he comes over to the house to play, it's emotional for me, and I'm his aunt. Like it's emotional for you as a mother. It's emotional for me as an aunt. It's emotional for the people who are on his team. You know how much they love your son, and it's so great to have people who are emotionally invested in our youth, in our children. It's emotional for everyone involved. It's emotional for him, even though he can't express it. And I think that honestly, that is such a beautiful way to end the conversation, in the sense of learning is emotional. Learning is happening all the time. Susie, we've learned so much from you today. Thank you so much for being here today with us and sharing your learning journey with us, and your resilience and your perseverance and your tenacity and your passion. It's been so wonderful having you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've had a blast, and thank you for even doing this podcast, because I'm telling you, I could have used a podcast like this throughout my learning journey, and I would have felt a lot less hopeless and alone if I had known how much of a tribe we really have out here.
That's so gratifying. Thanks for saying that.
Thank you for saying that, and thank you for being part of our community, and we can't wait to have you on again.
Yes.
And thank you so much to our listeners. We're so excited to have you here on season 3. Stay tuned for our next guest on Everything is Learning, and I wish everyone to have a great day. Thanks again, Susie.
Okay,
thank you.
Bye.
That's a wrap for this episode of Everything is Learning. If you loved this episode, share it, subscribe, and let's keep the conversation going.
Stay curious and keep learning. We'll catch you next time.